So we have both of our guests here today, Katelyn Polantz and Zoe Tillman. I'm welcome to both of you. Today is going to be about coverage of the courts. We are going to have a panel now on coverage of federal courts and kind of all the non-Supremes that are out there. Then we're going to have a professor at Georgetown from Georgetown Law talking about some basic big picture trends involving the Supreme Court. And then we have a panel of 4 Supreme Court reporters who are going to talk about the mechanics and the trends and the story idea generation for covering the Supreme Court. Today is the court's first session of the year. So one of the things we'll learn about is, if you're a Supreme Court reporter, you might have a hard pass or have a soft pass. Every hard pass holder out there is going to be at the court today. It's the first time many of them have seen Amy Coney Barrett in person. It's the first time that they've been at the court in the last year and a half. So all the hard pass holders who we normally have come talk with us, they're going to be over at the court this morning. But the people we have are people who have covered it and who cover it as on not an occasional basis, but they don't cover it as though they need to be there for every single session. So today is all about coverage of the courts. We'll be going from 9 till noon. 10-minute breaks in between each of the sessions, and then the happy hour tonight. So to talk about the federal courts, we have with us Zoe Tillman, who is a senior reporter with BuzzFeed News. She's based in DC, covers the courts, justice, and the intersection of law and politics. Then we have Katelyn Polantz, who is a justice and crime reporter for CNN, also based in DC. She primarily writes about federal court action and politically sensitive investigations involving the Justice Department and the separations of powers. She has covered the Mueller investigation, the Trump impeachment proceedings, congressional subpoena fights, and the Capitol insurrection. So we're going to go to Zoe first, and she's going to give a kind of a primer about the federal court system and how she approaches coverage of it. Then Katelyn is going to talk about coverage of courts at all levels, because she started her courts coverage at a local newspaper in Virginia. So she's covered local and state courts as well as now covering federal courts. As before, shoot any questions you have. I'll have questions for them after we hear from them, but we'll hear from Zoe first and then Katelyn, then have time for Q&A. So Zoe, welcome. Thanks a lot for coming.
Hi, good morning. I'm so sorry I'm late. I frantically messaged Chris a warning that if you have kids, never schedule anything at 9 a.m. because however confident you are that you'll be there right on time, things happen.
Don't worry about it.
So anyway, happy to be here and happy to talk about courts. I've been covering courts at BuzzFeed since late 2016. Before that, I was covering federal courts at the National Law Journal, which is how I met Katelyn. Before that, I was also at a local newspaper. It's how I also got my start, doing a mix of a little bit of everything. So, crime, courts, development, politics, education, and really just fell in love with legal coverage. The structure, the intellectual challenge of it, the drama of being in the courtroom, everything about it just clicked. So over time at the National Law Journal, that beat became very focused on federal district courts, and especially in DC, and the intersection of law and politics. And then over at BuzzFeed, sort of that same beat, but not so much focused on covering for lawyers, but covering for a general audience and trying to figure out how to translate, especially during the Trump years, just how much was happening in court, how little else was happening outside of court, and how much was happening in court, and translating that to an audience, at least for BuzzFeed, that skews younger, may not have much reason to interact with the legal system, and especially civil litigation and Administrative Procedure Act issues. So it's been a really wonderful challenge. And right now, I'm very focused on the January 6th Capitol riot prosecutions. That's been mostly a full-time job since January. So shifting from the civil litigation years of Trump to the criminal prosecution years, or at least this first year of the new administration. So that's sort of how I got here and the gist of what I do. To go over some of the basics of covering courts and what you're likely to come into contact with. Obviously, there's a federal court system, state court systems. Most national coverage will focus on the federal courts. It's a broader reach. It often deals with the cases or controversies that are more likely to affect people at a national level, even if they're in a particular district court. So there are, I believe, 94, Caitlin, tell me if I'm wrong, but 94, 93 federal
94.
districts. 94.
Just to look
Thank
that
you.
up for something else.
Great. 94 federal districts. A big thing that I always warn people about when I do these trainings in our newsroom is that within any given state, there may be multiple district courts. So if someone says, I'm filing something in federal district court in New York, the first question that you always want to ask is, what district? Is it the Southern District, the Eastern District, the Northern District? Some states are just a single district. So the District of Colorado, the District of Columbia. That's always the first thing that you want to make sure you nail down, because it's a very frustrating experience to be repeatedly refreshing the Central District of California website and seeing nothing about a case that's in the Northern District of California. So that's always a distinction that you want to know from the start. Cases that come through the federal courts, it's either mostly civil or criminal. There can be a mix of state court claims in a given case, but to be in federal court, you have to meet certain threshold standards. So for instance, in civil litigation, there either needs to be some kind of diversity jurisdiction where you've got a mix of parties from different places, which would take it out of that one state court. It can be because it involves an amount of money that's greater than, I believe it's $75,000, or it simply implicates only federal law. So a constitutional claim is most often going to be litigated in federal court. And then for criminal cases, you can sometimes see a mix again of federal or criminal crimes, but if there's a federal criminal statute implicated and a US Attorney's Office is prosecuting, unless you're in DC, which is always a different situation, odds are you're going to be in federal court. Just since you're all here, it's probably relevant. DC has no, it's a very different system. There is a local attorney general's office that prosecutes mostly low-level crimes, and then our federal US Attorney's Office prosecutes most major crimes. There's no sort of state DA equivalent in that sense. So your case gets litigated in your district court. There's a ruling, there's a preliminary injunction or summary judgment or a final judgment or a verdict. And those cases can then be appealed up to the circuit courts. There are 13 federal circuits. Those are, unlike in state courts where you may have multiple levels of appeal, you can have certain intermediate appeal courts before you get up to a higher level appeal court, before you get up to a state Supreme Court. In the federal court system, you've just got your district courts, your circuit courts, and then those cases, you can ask the Supreme Court to hear it. They don't have to, they can. So at the circuit court level, there is often where most federal cases end, very few cases. And you'll hear a lot more about the Supreme Court, which is not my area of specialty. Most cases resolve at the circuit court level. So, I think that's also been honestly part of my interest in covering the lower courts as opposed to the Supreme Court. I think there's a lot of action that happens at that level, and it tends to get a lot less coverage as compared to the Supreme Court. And there are really some good reasons for that. Supreme Court sets precedent nationwide, whereas a given circuit court decision is only binding on that one circuit. So if the Ninth Circuit says, we say that there is no right to X, that ruling is only binding on the states within the Ninth Circuit. I think the main exception to that, which you may see, especially covering politics, is where judges may issue a nationwide injunction of some kind, which would then apply across the country, which is also another really important thing to look for when you're writing about an opinion in a given case, is what is the scope of what they're doing. So cases go up to the circuit court level. There's some kind of decision after arguments, and whoever loses can then petition the Supreme Court to hear their case. But unlike what happens at the circuit court level, where they generally have to resolve the case in some way, Supreme Court doesn't have to do anything. So that's why it's always a big deal when the Supreme Court says, yes, we will hear a case, or no, we won't, because it's every other level. It's they have to do something. Supreme Court does not have to do anything at all. The main way that you're going to cover federal court cases is through a system known as PACER. It is it's often better than what state courts have, but in many ways it's also quite antiquated. It's an old system. It hasn't been updated in a long time, but generally speaking, you as the reporter will have access presumptively to documents and materials in cases. So whether it's the initial filings, the complaints, the exhibits, briefs, rulings, the presumption is that those are public and that they're available to you as the reporter and the public as well. And so much of my job is keeping tabs on what's new in PACER. So it's, constantly looking out for pings and doing searches in PACER for what's been filed today. Is it anything of interest? Some courts will let reporters sign up for email alerts in cases of interest. And DC is one of those courts. And for the purposes of anyone covering politics, it's a really helpful system. And I strongly encourage, if you think there's any chance you're going to be covering courts, getting signed up for that. So throughout the day, I'm getting hundreds of emails of alerts in cases that I'm following. So it's every docket entry. So a lot of my day is just sifting through all of those emails to say, is there a new court filing I need to read? Is there a decision in a case I'm interested in? Is there a scheduling decision scheduling order I'm interested in? Has a hearing been set on a case that I'm following? Is there a plea hearing? Is another capital right or pleading guilty? A lot of my day is just sifting, organizing, reading, scanning documents for the thing that might be really interesting or unnoticed, the footnote that is worth its story of its own. So, most of the time you're really not in court. You're doing a lot of reading, covering courts. And the other piece of that, obviously, though, is covering what happens in court. So right now, because of the pandemic, a lot of court proceedings have been remote, and there are dial-in systems to access that, which has been helpful in its own way. So there's also that element to it. So an important thing is making sure especially right now, how to cover a particular hearing, whether you do need to go to the courthouse, whether there's a dial-in system. DC is a court that makes that information available on its website, which is fantastic. The downside is it's audio only, so you don't get to see faces and meet people and catch lawyers out in the hallway. Some courts will do video, but you have to ask. It's really all over the place. And I think that's a key part of understanding how to cover courts at a national level, which is every district court is its own little fiefdom with its own rules, its own quirks, its own systems, its own ways of doing things. So, unlike it's sort of like covering, individual members of Congress. They all have different ways of operating their offices. So it's helpful to think of district courts and the circuits as being like that. There's often no central system besides PACER, but every district court has its own PACER site. So even then, it gets decentralized. So in terms of what you're looking for when you're covering a given case, the first phase is always reading the complaint or reading the indictment or the criminal complaint that's filed, and making sure you understand the full scope of what someone is asking for, how they're asking for it, and the argument they're making. It's really easy for an organization to put out a press release saying, we're taking X administration to court to help people do X. But then you read their lawsuit and it turns out they're asking for a very narrow, something very narrow from the court. And so the big thing is you never want to be a part of someone's PR strategy. So that's why it's always really important to not rely on the press release that goes out about a lawsuit, because it's easy to overblow or overstate what someone is trying to do and actually accomplish in court. So, it's reading all the claims. At the end, there's usually a section that's especially in civil litigation, called something like a prayer for relief. And that's where often you can see, this is what we're actually asking for. We're asking a judge to enjoin X law, or we're asking for a statement from the court that this is unlawful, or we're asking for money. And then sort of the other side of that is, in a criminal case, it's making sure you understand what are the crimes that they're charged with, setting aside whatever you may know about the criminal conduct involved. What are they actually charged with? What are the penalties that they're facing? And then what are the next steps from there? Are they being incarcerated before they go to trial? Are they being released? If they're being released, what does the public need to know about those conditions? Especially in high profile cases, it's important to relay that, this person is being allowed to go because they can pay a lot of money to do that. It can speak to certain inequities in the legal system. So those are all different stages of covering a civil or criminal case that you want to make sure you fully understand. It's never relying on what the lawyers tell you is going on. That's sort of supplementing what you've read yourself, because what ultimately matters is what is on paper filed in court. It doesn't matter what a lawyer says their overarching goal is. And then from there, the interest is always in, obviously, what is a judge going to do in a given case. So it's helpful to know who your judge is, where they come from, what their background is. Have they handled a case like this in the past, and what happened? You'll hear different schools of thought from reporters about when and whether it's relevant in federal court to note who the president is, who nominated a given judge, and the politics of the administration that put them on the bench. It's something I've thought a lot about. It's something I know Katelyn and I have talked about. It's a conversation that's ongoing. I think the easiest way to think about it is working from the top down. So at the Supreme Court, it's extremely relevant. Their confirmations are easily the most politically motivated. The decisions they make are more likely to reflect their ideological and political background and the experience that they bring to the bench, and their style of their way of looking at a given case. So that is sort of the easiest call, is to say, the conservative justices, the liberal justices, President Trump's nominees did X. It's relevant, it matters, it gives readers context. At the circuit court level, I generally find that the answer is still yes, that it's relevant. These nominations are moderately less politically explosive than Supreme Court nominations, but still quite political in their background and how they come about. So, if a circuit court, which is again setting precedent for a large geographical part of the country, if not nationwide, there's a reason that presidents put these judges on the bench where they are. They bring a certain ideological understanding and approach to decision making, and that is a part of the consideration of why they're nominated. So it does tend to be relevant in politically significant cases. The district court level is where I find it hardest to answer that question. It's, in most cases, it does not really matter. They have the least freedom in how they decide cases. They have to follow the precedent of their circuit. I think in particularly politically sensitive or politically important cases, where a judge is saying something that reflects their background, where they're doing something that makes it relevant to the reader to say, this judge was appointed by X person, I find that the answer is then yes. But if the answer is no, as a default, we at BuzzFeed don't put that piece of information in every story. I find that it can lead readers astray in giving them the right context to understand decision that's being made. So it's just something to think about as you're writing. It should never be reflexive. It should be a thoughtful decision that you make, because what you don't want is you never want to mislead readers, and you don't want to give them the wrong context for understanding something that happens in court. And if a decision isn't political and you say this judge was a Obama nominee or a Trump nominee, a lot of people will think that it's a political decision. And our job as legal reporters is to really make sure people understand how the system functions. And sometimes it does function in a political way, and sometimes it doesn't. So that's why you tend to see different approaches across newsrooms about how to handle that. As far as understanding what judges do, the way that I tend to read opinions is I start at the top, page 1. They usually do some kind of summary of what the case is and what they've done. And then I skip all the way to the bottom, where you're most likely to see the clearest articulation of what a judge has done. For this reason, the court enjoins the state of whatever from doing X. And then you've got your, the meat of, or I guess I don't know what the food analogy would be, but you've got your statement of what has been done, and then you go back through and get the meat of why they did what they did. But in an environment where for something big, you want to be getting something out ASAP. For us, we tweet first, write later. Not all newsrooms do that. But if you need to get it out quickly, generally speaking, that first page, last page will get you pretty far. And then filling in, the understanding of why, which is also obviously very important. But to understand the what is it's a way to do it. The other thing I try to convey, small thing, but it's important, is always read footnotes. Don't skip footnotes. It tends to be where judges can get a little spicy. It tends to be where they might say something really interesting or controversial. So just always make sure to read the footnotes when you're covering a decision in court. The other sort of big part of the job is keeping tabs on what judges are doing across similar cases and looking for patterns and trends there. So, it's during the Trump years, it tended to be, the administration has done X through executive action. Here's how judges across the country are handling this one particular decision that's now being challenged in multiple courts. So it's important to not cover any given case in isolation. It's important to know, if a judge is issuing an injunction or has denied an injunction, it's really important to know if a judge elsewhere has already entered an injunction. So it doesn't, in terms of informing readers what the status quo is, it's also really important to have that broader landscape in mind, because you could have a judge in Oklahoma, in the Eastern District of Oklahoma, saying, I'm not going to enjoin X thing that's been done, but you may have a judge in Minnesota who yesterday issued a nationwide injunction. So if you say an Oklahoma judge denied an injunction, period, you've not informed readers of what the status quo is on a given issue. So in the Capitol riot cases, which I think Katelyn will talk more about, it's that coverage in a single court. So it's understanding, all these judges are handling cases related to this one single event, and there are different defendants and different contexts and different charges, but it's not helpful to tell readers one judge did X without noting this is a pattern of judges, or this is a new development amid this landscape, or this judge did something that no judge has done yet. So it's always really important to keep that in context. And I'm just looking at my notes here. How am I doing on time?
You could be wrapping up here real soon, so we can get to Katelyn.
Great.
Is it good?
Great. Okay. The final thing I'll talk about is just in covering courts. Practically speaking, it's worth taking time before you start to think about how you will keep track of a case or cases going forward. It's worth it to know, responsibly. You want to avoid a situation where you write about someone suing someone and then you never write about that again. The best practice is to write at least to tie a loop, because otherwise you've just put something out there accusing someone effectively of doing something or breaking the law, and you want to make sure that you report it through. So, for me, it's a spreadsheet. Other reporters do it in a different way, but it's worth thinking about, how am I tracking this? How am I getting updates on this case? And how am I keeping tabs on this issue as it works its way through the courts? So just a practical piece of advice. It can be really helpful to sit down and think about your system and your method as you go forward. So I'll stop there.
Okay, well, thank you. Great tips. And I have several questions for you, but we'll go to Katelyn right now. And Katelyn will talk about some of her coverage of it and her coverage of courts in general, going from the local up to the federal, and then talk about some of the cases that she's been covering in federal court. So Katelyn, welcome.
Sure. So hi, everyone. I'm really glad that you just got to hear Zoe speak about how the courts work and what how to find things and how to read things that are filed in court and what to look for, because she's the absolute master of this and is the person who taught me how to read court filings. And I just, some of those tips, I needed that refresher. So the way that Zoe and I have worked in the past, we worked together at a publication called the National Law Journal, which is a legal trade in DC that's part of like a magazine system called American Lawyer Magazine for the legal industry. And we were sort of two sides of the coin of covering law. Zoe was reading the filings, covering the cases, following them, covering the judicial appointments, all of the things she walked through. And then what I did was not cover courts. I covered people. I covered people who worked in law firms in DC. And so we're basically, we both have come from a common set of skills, and I hope we can show you today basically that you can take those skills and they become a superpower in any newsroom in DC. So I'm going to walk through a couple things about like how you can use court filings to tell stories. But the two takeaways that I really hope everybody can get is that in Washington, I know that Madison is here and she does cover courts because we see her on Twitter a lot and read her stories quite a lot. But one of the things that happens a lot in court coverage is that people forget that there's a third branch of government in Washington. People spend a lot of time doing source reporting and doing coverage around Congress and around the executive branch, specifically the White House. And what Zoe and I represent is basically the side of the Washington press corps that covers what is happening in an equally important, but not as often as visible part of the government. And so if you can take away from this that to remember that there's a third branch of government, that's great. Second thing that's really important about court coverage is that in Washington and in court, really everywhere, nothing happens in a vacuum. So I'll get into this a little bit with some of my stories, but basically the thing that I think is really important for a lot of people to remember when you think about court coverage is it's really important to know how courts work, to know how they're structured, to know how to read filings, to know how to find lawyers. But at the end of the day, like Zoe was saying with the Capitol riot cases, where there's lots of cases going on at the same time, they are talking to each other, and you're looking at how judges are looking at similar cases and handling them differently. We're also doing that in politics. So we can see how, lawyers for President Trump or for the White House or for the Justice Department are approaching something in court versus how they're doing it in, public statements, speeches, how Capitol Hill is responding to something. So those are the two top lines that I want to make sure everybody sort of is thinking of. Don't write off courts as a niche beat that can't help you. Truly, it is like a total superpower to be able to think through court coverage and to know where you can go to find things in the court system. So the first thing I just wanted to show you was I, like Zoe, started at a local newspaper. I started at the Roanoke Times, which is in Southern Virginia. I know Zoe started in Maryland. And so we were sort of around DC, but not in DC, covering DC. And I covered a story called, I wasn't even covering this. I was like I was like an intern at the time. And this byline is from a friend of mine who was the actual court reporter, but there was a day as an intern that somebody in the newsroom said, hey, Katelyn, go over to the courthouse and look through all the paper filings that are there. And there had been a guy who was accused of murder. And I went through the paper filings and I found a piece of paper that was a search warrant. And it said that this guy who was accused of murder, the police took from his house anabolic steroids. And that was what was in the search warrant. I looked at it and thought, I think this guy's in the news. I wonder if this matters to anyone. I took it back to the newsroom, and Jorge, who is still my friend, who's the byline on this story, took it and was like, this is a huge story. So we broke this story about a piece of information that was inside a search warrant that I didn't even really know if it mattered or what it was or how it fit in. It turns out that this idea of anabolic steroids, that this guy who was a police officer who ended up shooting his wife in a Sheetz parking lot and killing her, that was his defense at trial, that he was on steroids and it was road rage. And so we were the first people to get that scoop because of this sort of filing that just a line and out of context and just a search warrant. And we sort of had to look at it and put it into context of a much bigger story for that community, which was this murder story that was just driving all of the coverage. And so this is an example of how you can find things in court filings that can always speak to something that's going on more broadly. And a reminder that a lot of times people write things in court filings, either the police, the FBI, prosecutors, even defense attorneys. People drop information into court filings because the court is a referee of the law, but also it is a way to speak to the public about what is going on in something of interest to the public. So, you know, this was a filing that happened without fanfare. If I hadn't gone to the to the clerk's office to see what was new, I never would have found it. And that lesson has really carried through even into now when we're following very closely watch cases where people are reading every single filing. You never know what is going to be in a filing and what someone's going to put, what someone's going to try and say in a filing and what might be newsworthy to tell a larger story. So one of the things, there's another story that's very similar to this in the Mueller investigation. So the Mueller investigation, I'm guessing all of you were in Washington for that, or you were coming into Washington very soon after the Mueller investigation had ended. The Mueller investigation was obviously the special counsel's investigation where they prosecuted lots and lots of people as part of the larger Russia investigation and investigation into whether President Donald Trump had obstructed justice. And so when this investigation was ongoing, the Mueller special counsel's office became very, very famous for giving no comment to everything. They did not talk. We had Caroline Kelly, I think, was in this group at one point and now has gone to law school. She was a person at CNN who was among a few people who stood outside the special counsel's office every single day for 2 years trying to get comment out of people going in and out. Nothing. People were not talking in the special counsel's office. What they were doing was they were writing things in court filings. And so I have a story that we did that this filing, I will never forget the night because it came in at like the deadline to file some sort of pretrial motion. I don't even remember what motion it was. The deadline to file a pretrial motion. In this case, all of the DC press corps, we were waiting for, there's a filing coming in the Manafort case from the Department of Justice. The deadline's midnight because the judge had set, the filing has to be made by X day. The filing's coming in at midnight. I'm sitting up on my computer. It's 11 p.m. There's nothing. Sorry. It's 11:40 p.m. Still nothing. And then at like 11:45, Mueller's office files a filing with their legal arguments before trial about their case against Paul Manafort, and attached at the bottom of this legal argument, a memo that basically said this is what Mueller's office was investigating related to Paul Manafort, and it was whether he was colluding with Russian government officials. Now, at that time, Manafort was not charged and ultimately never was charged with anything related to collusion or conspiracy with Russian government officials in 2016. But the fact that Manafort was under investigation for this and had been commissioned by the Justice Department years earlier for the Justice Department to look into this was really big news. And I still think it was a turning point in the Mueller investigation. When we look back at it, it was a very important story. It came in a court filing at 11:45. You can see, I think my byline, the date, the timestamp on when the story went up for us was like 7:30 a.m. because we worked overnight to get it up. And so that's an example of how prosecutors speak through filings, right? That was a document that we wouldn't have gotten elsewhere. The Justice Department never would have announced it, but it was something that, because court is allowing both sides to come to judges, to show evidence, to gather information, to make arguments, and also to speak to the public, it was a way where we were able to see what the special counsel's office was looking at in that moment, where we could get no information otherwise. The next thing I wanted to talk about was sourcing and how lawyers can be really, really useful. So, I said before that Zoe and I worked at the National Law Journal. I remember when I took that job, I'd worked a couple other places before moving into covering a legal trade. And I remember talking to reporters in Washington who would tell me, it'd be great you should be a web producer or a producer on a podcast or something similar to that at a really big name organization. And I was that's really good advice. If you have opportunities like that, like definitely feel them out. I was also getting advice from a mentor of mine who said, what do you want ultimately at the end of the day? What kind of reporter do you want to be? And I had always decided I wanted to be a reporter who had a source book, a Rolodex. When this job at the National Law Journal came available, Zoe was already there. There were already some other very, very, very accomplished legal journalists at the National Law Journal who I was aware of. And the job I ended up taking was one where I basically was able to just build sources in the legal community. I was writing about people moving from law firm to law firm, which is like not even it can be like kind of an interesting topic in the legal world, but those stories never get read elsewhere. Like if someone moves from X law firm to another law firm in like product liability, that's not really a story that any other publication will pick up except a legal trade. I was writing those like 2 times a day. And so what that allowed me to do, however, was it allowed me to meet lawyers across Washington. And the secret about lawyers across Washington is that most of the lawyers in Washington, well, all of the lawyers in Washington for the most part are very, very accomplished. The vast majority of them go to elite schools for law school. They're very well connected, and they're very good at what they do. On top of that, the way that they get to be that good is that after law school, a lot of them clerk for the top judges and then go and work for the White House, for the Justice Department, for the Public Defender's Office, for places that we want to have more of an insight into as journalists covering Washington. And so one of the things that I was able to do is meet lawyers that were former members of Congress and people who had been top people for people who would become appointees. Like there was a year that when Merrick Garland was nominated to the Supreme Court, Zoe and I, because we were positioned in finding lawyers throughout Washington, we contacted probably every single one of Merrick Garland's previous clerks for him on the DC circuit. And like literally we called every single one. And do you know where like most of them are now? They are all like big deal lawyers, and half of them are in the White House and some of them are in the Justice Department. And so all of the people like Washington is a community. The legal community is really a heart and soul of the Washington community, even if you're seeing, Congress generate a lot of news or the White House generate a lot of news. There's lots and lots of lawyers everywhere who can be sources. The revolving door is a real thing about how Washington populates, especially civil servant roles and political appointee roles where people aren't necessarily like elected politicians, but are doing the day-to-day work of running agencies. So that's my like bit on sources. I know I'm going a little bit long, but I just implore everybody to make sure that you remember that Quartz is both a sourcing beat and a documents beat. And if you can put those two things together, if you can ask people questions, if you have sources, you can find a lot more news. There's one other piece of news that I wanted to mention. Actually two, this will be quick. One is on this sourcing point. I recall a moment where we were in the Mueller investigation and we were looking at the docket of Rick Gates. And I probably can't, I don't know if I can show you my screen. Let me see really quickly. I can show you my screen. Okay, so you're looking at the docket for Rick Gates in like the end of 2017. Rick Gates is Paul Manafort's associate. I was just talking about Manafort a little bit. He was charged alongside Manafort and he was ready to go to trial. He had a bunch of lawyers. And basically, if you look at this docket at the end of 2017, we were already a couple of months into this case. And if you look at the numbers, this is a PACER. I'm looking at a PACER docket right now. If you look at the numbers over on the left side, there's some numbers that are missing here. It goes 120, 121, and then to 129. These are the numbers of filings. And I remember that at the end of 2017, I was looking at this docket and realized that there were documents missing. And I wanted to know why. And so I basically used this document, which was a PACER, a docket on PACER of this court case, to go into this reporting project where I decided I want to know what's going on in the behind the scenes in the Rick Gates case. Nobody has to tell me anything that is sealed, but something is up. And ultimately, through source reporting that I pursued following basically this tip in this docket, and through, you know, Caroline Kelly standing outside of Mueller's office and seeing various lawyers go in, we were able to confirm that Rick Gates was about to plead guilty secretly, that Paul Manafort at the time didn't even know that his colleague was, his longtime deputy was going to plead guilty. And this is one of the stories that originated, that came out of this reporting. And at the time, like, I don't think anybody, any other news organization in Washington even believed these stories. I mean, ultimately, Gates was going to plead guilty. He had done all the things that we reported. But we really did get an exclusive, a couple exclusives out of this marriage of source reporting, stakeout reporting, and document reporting about this court case. And this all comes from being on the court beat. And then the last thing, you know, I want to bring up, I mentioned about how the different branches of government are all really important. The third branch of government is really important and nothing happens in a vacuum. When you fast forward, the Mueller investigation really was very court heavy. It was documents. Again, with Capitol riot cases, it really is, the court cases really are driving a lot of the narrative. The Hill is going to come into play a little bit. But when we did the coverage of impeachment, the first Trump impeachment with Ukraine, there were a number of court cases that were spinning off related to whether people could testify, whether Capitol Hill could get access to certain records during the Ukraine impeachment. And I had colleagues on the Hill that were doing lots and lots of reporting of everything that was going on there. All of the hearings for the Ukraine impeachment were happening at the same time as court cases. So I was dealing with court cases. And I still remember there was a day where I'm writing notes to my editors saying, this is what they're saying in court today. This is how the Justice Department is characterizing impeachment. And lawyers working on behalf of the president, which were supposedly at that time in line with the Justice Department, which also wanted the president to be defended from impeachment, were saying something totally different in court. And so there's another link Chris has. So my colleague Marshall Cohen was covering the Hill that day. And basically we got a story that was leading CNN that had several segments on CNN because there were lawyers in court that were saying something totally different than the lawyers who were on television at the impeachment hearings about Trump and whether he should be able to be impeached. And so everyone is sort of talking to each other. It's really unusual for something like that to happen because a lot of times the court is signaling what might happen in the White House or on the Hill, but we noticed that at this one point in time, there was a total contrast between the two. And so I hope that gives a good overview of a couple ways that court coverage really functions as part of like a larger Washington conversation and is really central to covering this town.
Okay, so thank you very much. We were scheduled to go to 9:50 on this, but we can go a few extra minutes and get some questions in. So let me toss it out before I ask any questions. Let me toss it out to you, to the fellows. Do you guys have any questions, Madison?
Hi, Madison. Great. Hi, guys. Thanks so much for doing this. I had a question about when you're first starting out on the Quartz beat, is there anything that you did outside of regular reporting that helped you understand law better? Is there any books or classes or anything that you were able to take to help familiarize yourself with the area a little bit better to be prepared for kind of like those breaking news circumstances where you can't really familiarize yourself on a topic super quickly?
I never took classes. I didn't go to law school. I didn't take any courses when I started. The one thing I did that I still do is when I know something is coming or is calling up, finding a lawyer that seems trustworthy and calling them and saying, listen, off the record, completely just for my own purposes, can I ask you a bunch of questions about this to make sure I understand it? And I would say 99% of the time they're thrilled. Every lawyer is thrilled to get that call because it helps them and their client to have something accurately reported in the future. So they are often extremely willing to do that, whether it's a law professor or a lawyer in practice. Lawyers in practice tend to be better because they're the ones actually in the courthouse doing the litigating. But I would strongly recommend not hesitating to make that kind of call and to ask what you think are maybe like the dumbest questions, but do it because it makes a difference. But that's not very like official.
Yeah, my tips are like same. I mean, just calling lawyers. If lawyers, I think, are really good at wanting to make sure people understand. And so if you show any affinity for like wanting to understand whatever nuance they have or civil procedure, like they'll often explain it. There's a bunch of people on Twitter who like to explain things in real time who are really good lawyers. And like, you know, when stuff happens in the Fifth Circuit, there's like one guy, Rafi Malconian, who is like an expert on the Fifth Circuit, who knows that court way better than I could ever know that court. Like, I'm not based in Texas. I'm not writing about it that often. And I often, if I want a gut check, I often will go and just see like, okay, what does Rafi actually think about this thing that's happening in court in Texas? But a few of like, I ordered once I started doing this, like the court coverage full time after I left NLJ, I ordered a Black's Law Dictionary. I find that to be really helpful. I do look up a lot of terminology if I don't know it, especially if judges are using it. And then, you know, the one thing I didn't say before, and Zoe hasn't said, but kind of got close to, is that like, I am always reminding myself, don't get ahead of the judge. So you can really easily, like people in your newsroom could be like, what does this mean? What does this mean? And sometimes you just have to tell them, I can't tell you yet because I don't know. And all I have is this one sentence from a judge that I'm not going to read into any more than what it says exactly. And that's like the lesson of not getting ahead of the judge is one that will serve you well, like in lots of different circumstances. Like if there's a filing and it's signed by the judge, like it is not happening yet. Whatever somebody's asking for doesn't happen until the judge says it does. But it also is, I think that's also true in the circumstance of like figuring out what's going on, right? It's sometimes the judge is unclear and the parties don't even know what's going on until they go in for the status hearing and they get clarification. So, yeah.
Okay, we have a question from Tia and then Orion.
Hi, I have a quick kind of question. You know, Pacer is sometimes tough to log in and recently I found this website called Pacer Monitor. And I just wanted to ask you, yeah, is it reliable? Because I've been using it a lot.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
go ahead. I think Pacer Monitor is the one that you pay for. Is that right, Zoe?
Yeah, what I can do is I have a list of resources for tracking courts besides Pacer that I can send to Chris and pass it along. There are a couple sites, some are free and they're really good. One is Scoop, SQOOP. There's Court Listener, which is part of the Free Law Project, which is phenomenal. And the recap plugin is something that everyone should have, even if you're only covering courts once. So I can send that list of resources. Pacer Monitor there are a bunch of products that it costs a lot of money to use it. And if there are ways to get documents that should be free for free, I love to help people get that access. So I'll
Thank you
send that
so
over.
much. That really would be helpful.
Yeah.
Pacer Monitor I use just to see the docket without having to do all that logging in. But you're right, other stuff costs money. So thank you.
Mhm.
Okay, Orion.
Thank you, guys. I'm with the Spokesman Review in Spokane. Actually, I thought just before I have a question, but I was just going to read. Elena had a question in chat. She says, "I'm curious what topics or cases you're focusing on right now that you don't think are getting enough widespread attention." Either you guys have a thought on that, and then I'll ask another question.
I think always what is happening in jails and prisons in America is like crucially important. And I wish I had more time to do that kind of work. It's work that tends to only get done at the local level. And the contraction of local reporting has, I think, you feel it in an area like the criminal justice system, because it's hard to do at the national level. There's a few outlets like the Marshall Project that will look at it. But I think generally like the state of criminal justice, it's very easy for us to write about the politics side. It gets interest. People are going to be interested in that. But the stuff that's hard and important, I would say, and I wish I had more time. And also like qualified immunity, sort of police accountability in court. And there was a moment where we had some more bandwidth to do that reporting last summer, and I'm really glad that we did. And then like politics swept back in and they invaded the Capitol, and it's I wish I had more time to do that kind of work.
Yeah, I think those are both, I mean, those both are like totally, especially with COVID and in the jail system and in prisons, that issue was covered a little bit. And, the Justice Department, the Inspector General's Office of the Justice Department has done a lot of work in understanding how COVID spread in jails and prisons, but writing about it is really hard. It's hard to get into jails and prisons. And sometimes you see cases that pop up and maybe you file a story on a lawsuit, but that is really hard to cover. And I like my thinking, being somebody, I work at CNN, so I'm writing and filing often for our website, which is going in a lot of different places, right? It goes online, but it also helps to drive what our coverage is on television. And to this day, I every day wish that there was a way where the public could have as intense of a interest in following what judges are saying and what is happening in courts as they do, what is being said at press conferences on video. And the fact that we don't have video of courtrooms, I think that like the trial this summer, the Chauvin trial this summer was like a national moment of understanding and reckoning that people really were watching that court proceeding play out, every moment of it, the verdict, and we don't have that for the federal courts. We don't have video in the same way. And so that is one thing that I wish that we had, so that people could understand the power and impact of what is being said in court and what is being found to be the truth in court, because that is what courts do. They are like not just referees. They allow juries to make decisions. They allow evidence to come out.
Thank you, guys. I know we don't have a whole lot of time, but I'd appreciate if I hear from either of you thoughts on this. I have a chance to talk with the new U.S. attorney who was just confirmed this past week for the Eastern District of Washington. Talk with her later in the week, and I'm just, she's a fairly candid, easy person to talk to. But do you guys have any thoughts on like particularly good questions, things that could elicit some interesting answers that I might not think of for a brand new U.S. attorney?
Okay, and if I could just pause for a second, our next speaker, Louis Michael Seidman, is with us already. Professor, if it's okay with you, if we'll let this we'll take this last question and we'll start you like at 10:05. Is that okay?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Do you mind my eavesdropping here?
No, we'd love to have you here. So I just wanted to make sure. I don't want to take the questions, and I want to get to you. Just give you a heads up. So,
Great.
Katelyn and
I have a quick answer on. So this isn't just for the state of Washington, but for lots of states. Zoe touched on it a little bit, that the U.S. attorney's offices are the outposts of the Justice Department, and just finding out what is going on in your state. If you're doing local coverage, what is a priority to them there in that U.S. attorney's office might not actually be what is coming out of Washington, what Main Justice is saying. So that's really useful. And then also one of the things that we've seen in civil litigation over the last several years, especially with like gay marriage, you're seeing it with other big political issues, is you see coalitions of attorneys general. So that's state level politicians who are serving as attorneys general who band together and bring lawsuits. This happened a lot in the Obama years, where Texas was leading a coalition of largely Republican AGs who would sue the Obama administration over and over again on lots of different things. And then we saw that in the Trump years too, with Washington actually was one of the leaders who was bringing lawsuits on behalf of Washington, New York State, and a couple other states. And so, knowing what people are doing in this state is not always like exactly what you're going to hear out of Washington. I think it's really valuable too.
Yeah, I would say just piggybacking off of that, always getting a sense of what the expectations and priorities are that have been expressed out of Main Justice to the ground level prosecutors. And then understanding, the question I would ask would be something like, what are the areas where you see yourself making the most changes to how you exercise the discretion that prosecutors have? Is it, is it in drug cases? Are you going to be scaling back or ramping up focus on, this type of case, whether it's something that is going on in Spokane? I think there was a lot of limiting of sort of prosecutorial discretion when it came to drug cases in an administration that was very, cracked down on drugs. And but as more states move to legalize pot, and are you going to be scaling back the federal interest in those types of cases? Or is there another area where you think there could be more discretion exercised by your line level prosecutors? So that would be a question I would ask.
Thank you, guys.
Okay, well, great questions, and Katelyn and Zoe, both of you had great, very practical tips, which is I'm looking forward to writing up all these suggestions. I think you guys gave a great primer on how to go cover the courts. But that's all the time we have for this session right now. So Zoe and Katelyn, I want to thank you very much for taking the time to come talk with us.